Speaking of China's history, and something you mentioned earlier in the podcast, which I find to be really interesting, is this notion of the Century of Humiliation. I remember learning about this a few years ago, and just this notion that the way Chinese history has been taught, at least in the past 50 years, imbues people with this extreme concern about China's national sovereignty and integrity that stems from this period in the 1800s and early 1900s where China was just being conquered and harassed by various foreign states. Is that something that you've thought much about, or that you think motivates the psychology of and sort of political messaging in China today?
Absolutely. It is a central pillar of the Chinese nationalist narrative today. It has deep emotional resonance for pretty much everyone that lives in China. It's in the textbooks that Chinese students study. It's referenced in speeches, and there's holidays. There are literally holidays that you wouldn't call it celebrate, but commemorate like Japanese brutality, against China. And you can understand why, because, prior to the mid 1800s, China had thought of itself as this great empire with thousands of years of history, and that it was sort of the center of the world, and that it didn't need to learn much from say European barbarians, because it already had everything it needed. And so you can just imagine. Doesn't
Zhongguo literally mean central country?
Yeah. So it's So it's the center. We're scholars are debating to what extent that phrase was actually used back in the mid 1800s. So I don't want to say it, but certainly the mentality that China is the superior civilization on Earth was very much prevalent, at least in the Chinese government, going into the mid-19th century. So you can imagine the shock where the British, who had only been allowed in a few little trading ports and minor trade, decided they really wanted to sell lots of opium. They wanted to sell drugs, right? They wanted to sell drugs in China so they could get the money and then use that to bankroll their empire in India. And so in order to do that, they started putting pressure on China. China launched a war on drugs, and then Britain just brought in its navy and obliterated China's military and just started to impose what ends up becoming a century of what the Chinese call unequal treaties. Because it's followed by the French, it's followed by the Russians, and then infamously it's followed by the Japanese, who come in and inflict really like biblical brutality on China for decades, going all the way till the end of World War II. And so you can imagine just the huge shock that has on China. It absolutely is catastrophic, because China collapses in on itself. And so the fact that China was able to shake that off, the Chinese Communist Party is the ones, they claim that they are the ones that defeated the Japanese, and they unified the country. And so you can imagine how critical that is for their long-term legitimacy. Only we could have done that. We are the ones that have reversed the century of humiliation. And now, as Xi Jinping has said, we are now going to reclaim our rightful place in the world. And that's not just an abstract thing. There are lost Chinese territories that Xi Jinping has pretty much made clear he wants to take back on his watch. So Hong Kong, we're going to consolidate our authority there. That's already done. Now, next, maybe Taiwan, right? Not only did it used to be part of China, but there's this rival Chinese government there that's democratic and basically has this defense agreement with the United States. That cannot be allowed to stand if you're the Chinese Communist Party. And then the South China Sea and the East China Sea, that should be a Chinese lake, essentially. That should be our waterway that we control, and we decide who gets in and who gets out. I mean, this is so fundamental for the Chinese psyche, for the decision-making of the government, and for the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party, for the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, what they can sell to the Chinese people. I think we in the West tend to underestimate that, and tend to underestimate the emotional core and how it affects Chinese decision-making.
Yeah, that's why I find it so interesting, is because unless you've heard of that notion of the Century of Humiliation or taken a little bit of a dive into it, which I think most people would sort of have no reason to, you wouldn't necessarily know that the arguments about Hong Kong are connected in Chinese political rhetoric and in people's minds to the brutality of Japan towards them, right? Like, this is all part of one narrative, right? You can't understand how many Chinese people feel about the Hong Kong issue without putting it in the context of this historical meme of the Century of Humiliation. And I'm not sure what there is analogous to this in the West. I mean, we have the legacy of slavery in America, which is probably similarly deep to many Americans. But I'm not sure there's any direct analogy here. And it's something that I've always found fascinating and makes sense of a lot of the feelings of typical Chinese people on these issues.
Yeah, I think American nationalism and Chinese nationalism are very different. American nationalism, I mean, just look at the 4th of July. Like, we blow stuff up and like send the Blue Angels over, and it's this giant celebration, and is essentially commemorating, at least if you were in the dominant ruling class, just a steady progression of rising to become the richest and most powerful country in the world. And you're a relatively young country. For China, it's about what was taken away from us for an entire century, where we were absolutely ripped apart and brutalized by Western imperial powers and by the hated historical enemy, Japan. And so and we need to understand, it is commemorated. There are multiple holidays throughout the year, every year in China, that commemorate various atrocities that were perpetrated against China. And so it's a very different a very different way of kind of rallying people around the government and coming together as a nation. If you've ever been part of a group where you have this, like, it's us against the world mentality, it's like that, but times like a billion, right? So I mean, it's
probably a closer analogy to the legacy of slavery for Black people. It might be the sort of never forget mantra that Jews have about the Holocaust, something like that. But for a nation, obviously there are many differences, but.
Right. I mean, that's why I think this with slavery in the United States, because it was so horribly experienced by a particular segment of the population and not at the time the ruling class. It's different than what China has, where even if you're a top leader, you would end up getting brutalized. In fact, you might be singled out first by the Japanese, right? So it's a different kind of humiliation. For the United States, we have this horrible historical blot on our record that we're still working through. With China, it was like the entire nation was literally just brutalized by foreign invaders and their cronies that infiltrated within China.